Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GALA webinar series. My name is Allison Furch, and I'm the Executive Director at GALA. GALA is a nonprofit trade association connecting and supporting the global language industry. Today, we're going to have a presentation from Georg Kirchner at Dell EMC addressing their machine translation data collection program. Before we get to the discussion, I will quickly go over some platform info. You're probably all experts at this by now, but just as a reminder, you are muted and will remain so for the duration of the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can let me know by using your chat box, and I will work with you to troubleshoot them. If you have a slow internet connection where you are, your audio may be disrupted. And if that happens, you can use the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel to call in using your telephone. We are indeed making a recording of this presentation, and you'll be able to find it on GALA's website later. Usually we try to get it up the same day. If not today, then tomorrow. If you have any questions for our presenter, please type them in using the chat feature in the GoToWebinar panel. We will try to get to as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. And next, I would like to introduce our speaker. Since joining the industry in the early 90s, Georg Kirchner has held various roles in localization, including DTP engineer, staff translator, program manager, project management office lead, and technology manager. At Dell, Georg manages the MT program. So without further delay, I will turn it over to Georg for the rest of the presentation, and I will join you again at the end for Q&A. Georg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Allison. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for attending my presentation. This is a topic that's near and dear to me. I've lived it for the last 6 or 7 years pretty intimately. So we're talking about gathering MT data at scale in a complex environment. And before we jump into my slides, I want to make a few general statements. Number one, it seems to me that our industry is currently at a cusp, on a trajectory between old school translation management systems that go back 20 years, that basically back in the day allowed us to centralize the creation of translation packages. We used to call them localization kits. And then basically centralizing the take-in of the translated material once it comes back from the translation agencies. And at the other end of this arc, we're looking and seeing what I would call AI native translation environments that really deserve the moniker platform or solution because they do address, let's say, 80% of the needs of the typical translator and project manager. And my talk is going to be sort of situated in this murky area between the two, okay, where we're not quite where we're used to be 20 years ago, but where we're also not necessarily where we could be if we had the luxury of latching on to the latest and greatest technology. Now, from your perspective, I would say, and I'm speculating, you might say, wow, this is so 2010. We did this, we mastered this, this is not that exciting to us anymore. On the other hand, you may have someone in the audience who may say, wow, I never thought about this, really interesting. And then maybe you have someone in the audience who would say, well, it looks like very familiar to us, where we have the similar challenges and ambitions in our sort of trajectory to the next level of maturity. So Alison asked me to write up a summary of the presentation. It's chock full of pertinent concepts. I'm not going to read through them right here, but we'll try to dissect them in the following slides. So I prepared a few talking points. The first one is, I want to talk about our situation because everything is situational, and Dell is in a very specific situation that I want to quickly frame before we go any further. Next one is I want to take a look at the MT productivity data, sort of in detail, just so we all know what we're talking about. Then I want to describe a production environment that I think of as complex and that has certain challenges and opportunities. And the opportunities are obviously around managing that complexity. And I would say that complexity is best addressed by looking at options, by making decisions. Making decisions, as we know, is uncomfortable because you might be making the wrong decision and then you sort of have to recover from that. And then last but not least, I want to talk a little bit why we would bother thinking about that and applying ourselves to those kinds of challenges. So what's our situation? Dell is a big buyer of translation services. That shouldn't be a surprise. What makes us a big buyer of translation services? Well, for one, there's the volume. We translate quite a bit. Not as much as you might think, but still it adds up. And then we have the need for a variety of services, from translation to translation of multimedia to interpretation services, and the list goes on. We do work with a multi-vendor supply chain, so we don't put all our eggs in one basket. We do have existing translation technology, so we don't have a sort of a greenfield situation. We do use MT for three main use cases. One is to boost the productivity of the post editor. Another one is to serve up translations almost in real time to the end users, mostly internally. And the third one is, in terms of volume, I would say the biggest by far. That is for machine translation for downstream machine learning tasks, such as classification, text analysis for business intelligence purposes. We do own our MT models. We do not build a machine translation system from scratch, but we do own the models that we train. And our domain, I just have to spell it out. Even though it's obvious, we are in the IT technology domain. Now let's check out the data. So you see here a snippet of an Excel spreadsheet. And I took that from the past DQF, and it contains data that we sent from our translation management system at the time, TDC's GlobalLink. I reorganized the data a little bit to fit better into the format of this slide. And let's quickly go through the data points. So row number 2 shows the source sentence. Row number 3 shows the machine translation output. Row number 4 shows the post-edited machine translation. Row number 5 shows the post-edit distance calculated in characters added, deleted, substituted. Then number 6 shows the normalized edit distance, so the edit effort in relation to the sentence length. Number 7 shows the editing time in milliseconds. And number 8 shows the source word count, so which is 13. Now, this is quite a bit of data that you can do quite a few things with. So what can you do with that data? For example, you can calculate the average hourly productivity. For that, you would use the data points in row 8 and 7. You can take that a little further. Once you have the average hourly productivity rate for one language, you can do this for all languages, and you can rank the languages by productivity. by and large, you may not be surprised, but we have been surprised around one language, which was Portuguese. While Brazilian Portuguese was ranking at the top in terms of productivity, European Portuguese was ranking at the bottom, which certainly did take us by surprise. You can, if you collect this data over time, you can draw trend lines for post-edit distance and productivity, which is helpful if you want to monitor the performance of your MT models. You may be moving from one model to the next. You may be moving from one paradigm to the next, like SMT to NMT. You can correlate the post-edit distance and productivity. And while in general there is a correlation between the two, meaning if the post-edit distance goes down, then the productivity goes up. But if you look at our languages, and we studied that over 2.5 years, that is not necessarily so for each and every language. And you also have the data to customize MT models and quality estimation models. So for quality estimation models, you, for example, would need the source segment, the raw MT, the post-edited MT, and the edit distance score. And this kind of data you would think is easy to come by, but it is not. So the raw MT, for example, doesn't get written into the TMX. It may reside in the XLIF file, but how do you get thousands and thousands of XLIF files out of your system to extract that kind of data? So here's an example of a trend line. This is the average productivity, which is measured in words post-edited per hour. And it goes from July 2018 to June 2019. The language pair is English to German. We organized our data by the quality tier. So we're talking here about high quality data, meaning marketing translations. And the source of the text is MT. So it doesn't include fuzzy matches that you might be editing as well. So as you can see, the trend line is sort of a little all over the place. It pops up and down, but you might agree that overall, there's an upward trend from around 1,000 words an hour to 12,000 words an hour. Now, the next trend line shows the edit distance. So this is edit distance per 100 characters. Again, the gestalt of that trend line looks kind of similar, ups and downs. You may also agree that overall there's a downward trend from roughly 25 to 20. So this is sort of kind of a picture book story. Now the dots that I'm showing here indicate when we moved from one technology to the next. So we moved in August 2018 from customized SMT to generic NMT. And then at the next dot, we moved from generic NMT to customized NMT. So now let's take a look at the production environment. So we have the translator. And the translator is basically where all that good stuff originates from, all the data that we were just looking at. On the other hand of the slide, you see the buyer, that's us. We're paying quite a bit of money to pay for translation services. Now, we certainly do get the translations back. Do we get the data back that's so interesting for us to manage our MT business? That's where, we have challenges. We have intermediaries. We have the MLV. The MLV may subcontract out to an in-country single language vendor. We have 3 MLVs that we work with. Each MLV has multiple SLVs. and each SLV has, freelancers that they employ. Now, the translators, in truth be told, can also sit at the SLV level. So an SLV can have staff translators, MLVs can have staff translators, and even the buyer can have linguists on staff. The given translator may work for multiple SLVs. I don't think that's a secret. And a given MLV may be sort of using agencies across the board in the industry. Now, in terms of technology, you may find that a given MLV has sort of standardized their operations around one translation management system, that it may not be yours. So there's a disconnect. You may have another MLV who is okay with working on your TMS, but how are they going to create accounts? How are they going to extract information to keep track of the work, paying their translators? You have translators who may not want to use their own CAT tool because they feel that way they're the most productive. You may have translators who don't want to be known, right? They want to be sort of incognito and not visible to the buyer. Now, given the situation and this environment where, we're hoping to gather the data that we were talking about, I think you need to make decisions. And I thought of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 factors that you may want to consider. I'm sure there are more. And each and every factor may have driving whys and enablers, but I tried to keep it to 1 for each row. So what are we doing with vendor strategy? Are we having a multiple or a single vendor strategy? I mean, the answer already provided, which is we are working with multiple vendors. I do not think it would even be within the control of the translation team to choose or go for a single vendor option. So we're basically talking about procurement constraints. Now, what would be really nice in this environment, which our industry does not have, it's not totally pertinent to this conversation, but I did want to throw it out after all. What we do not have is a cost model exchange format. So if you think of it, our industry has standards for translation memories, that's TMX, for term basis, this is TBX, for segmentation, that's SRX, for files that go through the workflow, that's XLIF. But the most interesting piece, we're talking about money, there is no standard. So the pricing sheet of each and every vendor looks different. Line items that basically mean the same thing are called different things. Just think of no matches versus new words. It would be really helpful for everyone involved, tools providers, admins, vendors, to come up with a standard. And I'm not talking about the unit rates, I'm just talking about the line items. So TMSs, so translation management systems, how many do we want to have in our universe ideally? I assume you can guess the answer. It is 1, right? So we want to have 1 tenant. In order for the translatables to be tracked throughout the entire round trip, okay? So we want to achieve continuous visibility. So we would not want to daisy chain, let's say, multiple instances of the same TMS technology. No, we want to have 1 tenant and all the work happens on that system. Now that puts a strain on the MLVs. I already mentioned it around, creating accounts, around extracting information, around assigning workflow steps automatically. And this is where APIs come in. Most recently, I saw, you know, sort of a startup that was basically had created a middleware where things are configurable and where you can basically establish a connection between our system and the vendor business management system, such as Plane, in a very nice way. So it looks kind of interesting. Workflows. So I'm talking about the electronic workflows in the, in a translation management system. The choice would be black box. By black box, I mean that there's only one discrete workflow step that stands for all the processes that may go on the vendor side. Okay. And the alternative to this is a verbose workflow, for example, where, if there is translation, editing, and proofing, well, there are 3 steps in the electronic workflow as opposed to 1. Why is that interesting? It's interesting because of data granularity, so you may want to track the post-edit distance from one step to the next. You want to track and see if the editor is adding any value in addition to the translator, or if they're just, changing things for the sake of changing things, which we have seen. Now, if you go back to this idea of MLVs having different sourcing models, you have an MLV who has a big set of staff translators, another MLV may more rely on agencies. So they have different needs around the workflow. So someone who has staff translators, they may only need the translation and the editing step. They don't need the proofing step. Whereas someone who outsources, an MLV who outsources to an SLV, they may very well need the translation and editing, which is done by the SLV, and the proofing, which is done by the MLV, just to double check that everything is fine before they hand back to the buyer. Now, ideally, we as admins would want to have only one workflow that services both of those use cases. So what you need in your system is the ability to basically exclude or include select workflow steps. And ideally, that's done by the vendor PM. And it's ideally done at the beginning of the project so that they don't have to monitor things. Okay, so they say, oh, something coming in from Dell, it has TEP, we don't need P, I'll just exclude it, and I then don't need to monitor the project as it sort of advances through the process. Translation editor. Well, here's the option of offline versus online. By offline, I mean mostly a desktop CAT tool that may or may not be connected to the central TM. I would guess if someone does work on a desktop client, that they would not be connected to the central TM for performance reasons. So they're really offline or online, which means that the translator accesses the translation environment through the browser. The CAT tool is co-located with the the leveraging engine, and therefore provides good performance. So if it were up to me, I would pick the online option. And the online option I would pick in order to create a controlled environment. So imagine you have hundreds of translators, they constantly come and go, and you would leave it up to them, to use their preferred CAT tool, to install plugins, to generate that post-edit distance and time spent in segment, yes, no. So you're totally at the mercy, and you're also inconveniencing the individual translators to create and control an environment that captures the data that we really want to, harvest on scale, at scale. Now, what's the enabler for working online? It's performance. Okay, there's no question about it. You need to have a capped environment where you can move from one segment to the next within a second. If you have to do a concordant search in a big set of translation memories, it shouldn't take longer than a few seconds. And then the translators will stick with your translation environment. Now, sort of looking again at the industry level, I think I mentioned the AI-based platforms. You know, the conversation is over. So there's no offline option. There's no preferred desktop cat tool option. The translator basically need to be trained up on that platform. And quite frankly, if you think of how many controls a cat tool has, you know, how big is the difference between hopping into a rental car and figuring out where the lights are and where you adjust the seat from a cat tool, right? So basically, I would say that if a translator needs to hop from one cat tool to another, you inconvenience them sort of at the same extent. At least that's what I claim. Now, translator account. So we already established in the line above that we want people to work online, which means that they need to interact with the system directly. There is no intermediary, so they need to be present on that platform through an account. And now the question is, you know, are we going to give them anonymized accounts or named accounts, anonymized accounts such as French 1, German 2, or, you know, named accounts such as Alexandra and Isabella? You may have guessed it right. I would want to go for named accounts. For what reason? Well, probably the security reason is the easiest one to sell. But honestly, I think more of a sense of community. You know, you want to, translation is a team sport. And if you have people working together and you know the names, it makes for a much more pleasant environment. And I don't think there should be any issue with translators putting their names to the work they perform either. So I think that would create some sense of accountability. Now, what's the enabler there? GDPR is pretty obvious, right? So the tool needs to be GDPR compliant. There needs to be an opt-in or opt-out option for the translators. You also need to have some kind of obfuscation of the named account, especially in this relationship between the SOV and the MOV. You know, if the MOV had access to the in-country linguist for a certain locale, Japan comes to mind, then they probably would just work with the translator, not with the SOV. And the SOV is concerned about that, and they would only want to be present on this platform if the identity of their translators is secure vis-a-vis the MOV. So these are sort of, you know, 5 pretty critical factors that I think if you make the right decision, and I claim that the decisions that I made here, they would allow you to basically take a translation management system that is not state of the art, you know, that is sort of has some history, and deployed and applied in a way that allows you to gather that data at scale that we're so interested in. So why are we so interested in that data? You know, I said that we're a pretty big buyer. And because we're a big buyer, you know, people are knocking at our doors. And machine translation and technology providers and service providers, they may know that, hey, Georg runs sort of an 80-20 approach, you know, where he's trying to reap 80% of the benefits with a 20% effort. Wow, you know, he should be able to try a little harder. He should be able to do a little better and bring more ROI out of OT than he currently does. So people talk to us, right? They provide us with their proposals. If you don't have any data, don't know how much productivity you currently generate, those conversations are kind of drawn out, right? Because you're trying to suss out where you are, you're trying to suss out where the vendor is. They may not have any hard data around how much improvement their, efforts will provide you with. So having a sound base of data when you go into those conversations are really super helpful. Now let's assume a provider made a really good pitch. It really sounds compelling, but it comes with a hefty price tag, right? So let's assume you have a program with 20, 30 languages. Typically those charges apply to each language separately. Now, if you can somehow and don't want to upfront commit to this hefty price tag, you could say, well, let's do a pilot on 1, 2 languages. And if you do that pilot, then you need this environment where you get that data very quickly, that productivity data, post at a distance, time spent in segment. And then what you can do, with our volume that we generate on a daily basis, we would be seeing fairly quickly in the trend lines if that technology makes things better, right? Is the post-edit distance dropping? Is the productivity spiking noticeably? And you would want to have that kind of feedback within a month or 2, I would hope, so that then you can make decisions on which way to go. Now let's assume you say, fine, this is fantastic. It's gonna really save us effort and time and money potentially. So you need to talk to your LSPs, right? The LSPs want to see proof that this improved MT environment has superior qualities. And if you can't really demonstrate that, well, the conversations are going to be long and painful and mutually frustrating, I would expect. So just a few more points. I talked about data at scale. Why is that so important? Data at scale is important because, we saw the variances in the trend line. So clearly there is something going on. When we looked at the individual example, you saw 63 seconds for a sentence that didn't look terribly complex. Sounds like a lot of time spent. We know that on average, translators would spend maybe like 20 seconds on a sentence like this. But you only can sort of establish a reliable norm in the outliers if you analyze plenty of data. So doing this with little samples here and there, that would be kind of difficult. So back to my pilot idea, right? We would need to accumulate the data quickly so that we can make decisions quickly. And then one last point here, which is sort of very minor, but in a production environment, not uninteresting, which is translators who post-edit your MT output, they will react to individual jobs, right? They will not make blanket statements and say, it's getting better, it's getting worse. No, they will hone in on the job. They will show you the sentences and say, look at this, the MT output is bad. And if you do not have the data, this post-edit distance data, and the time spent in segment to sort of match up their feedback, again, the conversation is going to draw out. It will be inconclusive. People will walk away. not very satisfied. So since we were talking about data at scale, I inserted here a snippet, and this is the data, the underlying data behind the trend line that I showed in the slides further up. So we're talking about English to German, time frame July 18 to June 19, and the word count is pretty significant. We're talking 1.3 million new words, okay? And that's a boatload of data. And even though we had a few snags in our setup, I would say just the fact that we have that much data and generated posted at a distance, time spent in segment based on 1.3 million words, those trend lines are meaningful. If you compare those 1.3 million words to a human evaluation that you typically do, up front or maybe sort of off and on while a model is deployed, you're looking at samples of 1,000 words or 2,000 words. Okay, I mean this pales in comparison to the 1.3 million words. And so this is all based on a paper that I wrote for the EAMT. They were kind enough to, publish it. If you're interested in the nitty-gritty details of what we did over 2.5 years, I invite you to check it out. It's basically, the proceedings are here. And if you look for my name, you will find the paper. And with that, I'm basically done, and I'm handing back to Allison.
All right, thanks, Georg. I'll take this opportunity to remind you, if you have questions, please use your chat box to type them in, and I'll kick that off with a couple of questions, if you don't mind. I'm wondering about the really high altitude view and something that might be interesting to people controlling the purse strings, let's say. And I'm just wondering, for Dell, you did this for 2.5 years. Could you summarize the impacts that you had, by gathering the data and analyzing it? Tell me about some of the changes that were made, or decisions that were executed, or money that was saved. Maybe summarize some of the big level impacts, if you would.
Well, let's see. The first one is, we're using an MT provider that is sort of provides high scalability MT. It's Microsoft. The price point is right. Everybody knows what the prices are for those providers. Google versus Amazon versus Microsoft. I find it a really nice feature, for one, that those providers are very upfront with their pricing schemes, and you can easily compare. Microsoft, well, compares favorably. I mean, if you do customize, it's probably more expensive than Amazon. But clearly, we saw overall trends going down for post at a distance and trends going up for productivity. And having seen that, we said, okay, we're going to stick with what we have for now. Had we seen different trends, clearly, I would have taken that to management to say, hey, we need to consider alternatives. We have to try a little harder. We have to maybe look at alternative MT providers. We may have to invest in data preparation and those kinds of things. So basically, how should I put that? The data that we saw made us feel comfortable to make no changes.
That's right. Sometimes it's validating, right? And that's meaningful too.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a question that I'm going to try to parse out a little bit and maybe into two parts, and it has to do with the actual collecting of all the data. And so Adarsh is asking about, do you have recommendations about data storage or analysis? Is building a data warehouse and data analytics pipelines worth it? And so the second half of that might be a question about buy-in. Buy-in from your team, buy-in from management, buy-in from LSPs and the translators that are willing to do what it takes to, like you were saying, extracting the data from all those XLIF files. That's not easy. So maybe could you talk about some of the practicalities or challenges and the lessons learned there about the data collection and analysis part?
Yes, absolutely. So this is now, I'm basically describing the ins and outs. Okay, so we were on a translation management system, TDC Global Link. We started to use it in 2015. We had two things going, apart from the tool being very powerful. We had, and this was a quality team, had decided before 2013 to organize content by the tiered quality model. So we had the structure in the TMS and the translation memories structured around, one, accuracy, two, readability, three, fluency. That was fantastic. It makes everything so much easier. And it also guides your MT implementation. What else did we have? Jaap van der Meer approached us and said, hey, you guys, do you want to implement and integrate Global Link with the TAS DQF? Because we want to analyze the data and present it to you so that you can then make business decisions from having that data visualized. And so it took us a little while because, we had aimed fairly high in our implementation. It came to fruition in 2017. And from then on, it was really a pipeline, okay? The translators started to translate online. The data would flow. I mean, there are a few things that I did, and that's in the paper, okay? I'm very honest about all the little snafus. One of which was failed to also track productivity for human workflow steps. There were reasons to it, but I failed to, said no at the time. I regret it to this day, okay? Because obviously you would want to measure the productivity between HD and MT for comparable jobs. I didn't think at the time we would have comparable jobs. So if you're serious and you want to try to do something like this, read my paper so you understand all the things that you need to look out for. The other thing that we had decided on was, and that was before that integration, that, we're going to aim high, the translators will be working online, and the translators will be known. And those were all sort of the ingredients that then, once the integration was built, enabled us to collect this data effortlessly, okay? So that's the data ultimately is stored in this case at a third party. You may find that the tools providers, for good reasons, right? I mean, they have to make money, they have a business to look after. They are kind of reluctant to share that data, right? Because they are investing heavily in their platform. So why should they just, open the doors and pipe it off to a third party? And then that third party can reap the benefits. So you will find, depending on what technology you're on, they may say, no, sorry, we'll accumulate the data for you, and you can pair, yourself over time, but we may not integrate with the third party. But I must say, if you look at the TAS DQF, there are quite a few integrations up and running at this point. Not sure if there's another thing, people are very reluctant of sharing the data, that is the buyer. And honestly, I don't know why that is. because you already shared the data with the MT provider, right? You already shared the data with your translation agency. Why are you having issues sharing it with a third party? I could never fully understand that, okay? So, but if you're talking to the security team again, you know, or the lawyers, you're in trouble, maybe.
Yeah.
The analysis, so basically that kind of answers those two, sort of, right? Definitely the data storage, the analysis piece, you know, if you look at the DQF, you can consume the data in various ways. That's pretty helpful. You can extract it, you can retrieve the data. You could push it into Tableau. If you have Tableau engineers, then you can visualize the data as you please.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned, well, part of that was the buy-in and the challenge with the buyers about sharing, you know, sharing the data. Did you face any issues with tracking translators' editing time? And if yes, how did you overcome them? That's from Miriam.
Sorry, say that. Where's the challenge of tracking of individual translators, you mean?
Individual translators' editing time.
Okay, so we were not interested in individual translators, okay? We were interested in the quality of our MT output. Each and every translator works differently. You know, we are not here to, let's say, police individual translators. We have hundreds of translators. So we rolled up this data, and we could have rolled it up at the vendor level and said, hey, you know, vendor A, you guys are a little less productive than vendor B, same MT technology, same content type, what's going on? But, you know, as long as the translator gets paid by the word, we don't care if they're faster or slower, right? If they were to get paid by the hour, it would be a different conversation, right? And so we pay by the word. And so if people are faster, slower, we don't care. Now, the individual translator in this TAO's model, the nice thing about it is if they wanted to look at their own data, they could create an account, they could log on, and they could monitor their own performance and then say, you know, you guys are paying me such and such, but I see, and I'm not a slow typer, but I see the performance is not that great. You know, it doesn't look right to me. So there's this democratic idea around data and data availability to the vendor, to the buyer, and to the individual translator.
That's true. I hadn't thought about it that way. Question from Maria about quality estimation, and she'd like to know if you're using the data also for quality estimation models, either internally developed or through a third party.
So we're trying, okay? So we're talking to experts in the field to do quality estimation. And I would say that the conversation is ongoing. So we're basically, we don't have anything in production at this point.
Okay. I think about one more question. And by the way, to the audience, if you have anything else you'd like to ask, please go ahead and type it now. And if we do end before we answer your question, then Georg can get back to you. So two things. One, I think it would be great, Georg, if we could share the link to the EAMT paper. I know that you hovered over it and we could see it for a moment, but if there's a way you can copy it and paste it into the chat, that might be nice for those who are keen to read that. And maybe we'll just wrap up with a question about the future. And that is, you know, how would you rate the effort and the cost to your team specifically to implement this data collection program these last couple of years? And will you keep doing it?
Good question. Well, we want to keep doing it. We currently don't have the capability because we are now on another platform that does, depend on plugins and whatnot. We can collect the post at a distance. So this is something we want to make sure that we can do in the future. I think we have more admin work to do to make this happen. I feel very uncomfortable flying blind. Okay, so it's the capability that came and went and that we want to recover. And, sometimes when you lose a capability, then you really realize, wow, it's really super helpful. So we need that, okay? So that was, I don't think I answered the full question. Was there some other aspect to that question?
Well, basically just wondering about the cost to your team, and not just financially, but otherwise as well.
Yes, the cost. Well, the cost was, I think the cost was significant on the tools provider side. The cost was, project managing it, which was not exorbitant. I think what you will find is that more and more translation management systems will have those capabilities out of the box. Okay, I cannot imagine that companies will get away with, not capturing this data by default. And this is, remember we was talking in the beginning about this arc, and we're at the apex, and sort of on the one side you're old school, and the other one it's, the AI platforms where all that data is just, it gets, the data collection is built into the fabric, okay? So it may very well be worth looking around, if you're in a greenfield situation where you don't have a TMS yet. I mean, you may want to put this on your list of requirements before you pick and commit to a system.
And you also mentioned just briefly this notion of technical interoperability, and I think you were probably referring to the Zilio hub when you were talking about the middleware or the connector. But GALA has a vision of having a lot more technical interoperability that would make data sharing like this easier, even if they had a daisy chain kind of environment like you mentioned. Well, Georg, thanks a million. I have to say that the complex production environment moniker that you put in the title really came to life with that slide that by the end looked like kind of confetti on the page. Thanks very much for sharing your expertise. Another big thank you to our participants for joining us. We'd appreciate it if you guys would take just a moment to give us your feedback on today's session. There's a super brief post-event survey that will pop up for you, and your perspective helps us continue refining our webinar program. Georg, any final words to the audience before we say goodbye?
Well, you were making allusions to topic.
Yes.
Okay. And I did not mention it. So I wanted to acknowledge that there is this initiative that I think some of your members are after. Topic is about creating full interoperability between any kind of tool, okay, as far as I understand. Whether it really then covers all the data points, right? We're only in the beginning, sort of the payload, as far as I understand. It's a very ambitious goal, I would say.
Yeah.
It's and so what I'm talking about here is sort of the poor man's version of topic, okay, or maybe the realist's version of topic, to make it happen in a very specific environment.
Fair enough. And you're right. It's ambitious, particularly when it's a volunteer-driven initiative.
Right.
Okay, thanks for mentioning that. So final point, I just like to say to everybody that the call for proposals is open for our spring digital conference. It closes on the 15th of this month. If you have something you want to share, please submit a proposal. You can find that in the events section of our website. And for now, I will wish you a good day or a good night, depending on where you are. And I will look forward to seeing you at another GALA webinar soon. Thanks, Georg, and thanks everybody for joining us. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.